The greatest mistake I ever made was believing a man with everything had nothing left to lose. I remember the sound of rain tapping against the stained glass windows of St. Andrew's Cemetery, as if the sky itself had come to say goodbye. The black umbrella in my hand shook slightly, though I couldn't tell whether it was from the cold November wind or the weight of the moment standing in front of me. A row of white roses rested against a polished granite headstone, their petals damp from the storm. The name carved into the stone was one I knew better than my own. Grace Parker, 27 years old. Beloved sister. Cherished friend. Gone too soon. The words blurred as water gathered in my eyes. Across the cemetery stood Ethan Blackwood, billionaire, CEO, the man every magazine called untouchable, the man whose photograph appeared on skyscrapers, financial reports, and charity galas. Yet none of those titles seemed to belong to the person standing there now. His expensive black coat hung loosely from his broad shoulders. His hands were buried in his pockets as though he had forgotten what to do with them. The wind pushed through the bare trees, carrying away the last golden leaves of autumn. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't seem to notice anyone around him. He only stared at the grave. For a long time, neither of us said a word. Then, finally, I heard his voice. Low, broken, barely louder than the rain. You gave up everything for me. The confession drifted through the cold air and settled somewhere deep inside my chest. This was not the Ethan Blackwood the world knew. This was not the billionaire who negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking. This was a man carrying a grief so heavy it bent the entire shape of his life. I looked down at the roses. Grace had loved white roses. She once told me they reminded her that simple things could still be beautiful. It was such a small memory, but it struck with the force of a tidal wave. Ethan slowly stepped closer to the headstone. His polished shoes sank slightly into the wet grass. For a moment, he reached toward the granite as though he expected her hand to reach back. It never did. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his face strained against emotions he could no longer hide. I should have seen it, he whispered. I should have known. The rain intensified. Tiny drops rolled down the stone and over the engraved letters of Grace's name. Ethan stood perfectly still, letting the storm soak through his coat. He looked like a man willing to trade every dollar he owned for one more conversation. One more smile. One more chance. Watching him, I finally understood something people never write about in magazines. Wealth can buy security. It can buy houses, cars, private jets, and entire city blocks. But it cannot buy time. And it cannot buy back the person who taught your heart how to live again. As Ethan lowered his head, the church bell in the distance rang once, then twice. And standing there beneath the gray sky, I realized this story was never about a billionaire. It was about a maid who changed a broken man's life forever. 1 year earlier, the first thing I noticed about Blackwood Manor was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind that settles over a home at the end of a long day. This was the kind of silence that felt abandoned, as if laughter had packed its bags and left a long time ago. The mansion sat on nearly 20 acres outside Greenwich, Connecticut, hidden behind iron gates and towering oak trees. I tightened my grip on the worn strap of my duffel bag as the taxi disappeared down the long driveway. Standing there in my thrift store coat, I felt impossibly small compared to the massive stone estate rising before me. I was 27 years old, carrying $200 in my checking account and enough worries to fill a freight train. My younger brother, Noah, needed another round of medical treatments. Rent was overdue again. The diner where I worked nights had cut hours. When I saw the advertisement for a live-in housekeeping position paying more money than I had ever earned, I applied before I could talk myself out of it. The front door opened before I could knock. A woman in her 60s stepped outside. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her posture was straighter than most people half her age. "You must be Grace Parker," she said. "I am Margaret, head of household operations." Even her introduction sounded expensive. I followed her inside and immediately understood why the job paid so well. The mansion was immaculate. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers overhead. Paintings lined the walls. Fresh flowers sat on tables larger than the apartment I had grown up in. Yet despite all the beauty, something felt missing. The rooms were spotless but lifeless, elegant but empty. As Margaret led me through the main hall, I noticed framed family photographs displayed on a grand piano. Most featured the same man. Tall, dark-haired, serious, even smiling. He somehow looked distant. Ethan Blackwood, the owner of the estate, the billionaire whose name appeared regularly in business magazines. You will rarely interact with Mr. Blackwood, Margaret explained. He prefers privacy. Something in her tone suggested that privacy was not exactly a preference. It was a rule. We stopped in front of a large set of windows overlooking the back gardens. Even in late autumn, the grounds were beautiful. A stone fountain sat in the center, surrounded by rose bushes preparing for winter. Then I noticed a man standing alone near the fountain. He wore a charcoal coat and stared at the water without moving. From this distance, he looked less like the owner of a billion-dollar empire and more like someone waiting for a train that never arrived. Margaret followed my gaze. That is Mr. Blackwood. The words were barely out of her mouth when the man turned. For a brief second, his eyes met mine through the glass. The air seemed to leave my lungs. Not because he was handsome, though he was. Not because he was wealthy, though everyone knew that. It was the sadness. Deep, unmistakable. The kind that settles into a person and refuses to leave. Then he looked away and continued staring at the fountain, as if I had never been there at all. I should have forgotten that moment. Instead, I carried it with me for the rest of the day, because something told me the loneliest man I had ever seen was about to change my life forever. The first week at Blackwood Manor taught me two things. First, every clock in the house worked perfectly. Second, Ethan Blackwood barely seemed to exist inside the life he had built. I usually started my mornings at 6 o'clock. The mansion was still dark then, the hallways quiet except for the distant hum of heating vents and the occasional creak of old wood settling. Most people imagine wealthy homes as warm and lively places filled with family breakfasts and conversations. This place felt more like a museum. Beautiful, impressive, untouched. Every room looked ready for a magazine photo shoot, yet none of them felt lived in. On my fourth morning, I carried a basket of freshly folded linens down the west corridor when I noticed a door standing slightly open. Inside was a private sitting room overlooking the gardens. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting pale gold across the furniture. Everything was immaculate except for one thing. A coffee cup sat on the table beside an untouched breakfast tray. The coffee had gone cold. The toast remained untouched. Even the orange juice was still full. I knew immediately whose breakfast it was. Ethan had not eaten again. Later that afternoon, Margaret confirmed it without meaning to. He has been skipping meals for years, she said while reviewing inventory reports. Some days are better than others. Years. The word lingered in my mind. I had only been there a few days, yet I already recognized the pattern. Ethan left before sunrise, returned after dark, spent most evenings alone in his office overlooking the south lawn. Staff members spoke about him respectfully, but always carefully, as if discussing a storm that might suddenly change direction. Nobody disliked him. Nobody seemed to know him either. One rainy evening, I was dusting bookshelves in the library when I heard footsteps outside. Through the tall windows, I spotted him crossing the terrace. Rain fell steadily from the gray Connecticut sky, soaking his coat almost immediately. He did not seem to notice. He simply stood there staring toward the gardens. The fountain, the roses, the same place I had seen him on my first day. Something about the image unsettled me. Not because he looked powerful, not because he looked wealthy, because he looked tired. The kind of tired that sleep cannot fix. Before I could stop myself, I stepped into the kitchen and poured a fresh cup of coffee. The mug felt warm in my hands as I walked toward the terrace doors. Halfway there, common sense finally caught up with me. What was I doing? I was a housekeeper. He was my employer. Billionaires probably did not want strangers bringing them coffee in the rain. Embarrassed, I turned around and placed the mug on a side table near the entrance instead. An hour later, I returned to collect it. The cup was gone. The next morning, another breakfast tray came back untouched. But the coffee cup I had left near the terrace was sitting in the sink. Empty. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I noticed something else. For the first time all week, the chair beside the library window had been moved slightly, as if someone had actually sat there. It was a tiny detail. Meaningless, probably. Yet somehow it felt important. Because sometimes the first crack in a wall is so small nobody notices it. Until one day sunlight finally finds its way through. 3 days later, I accidentally discovered the one room nobody ever talked about. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon while most of the staff prepared for an investor dinner scheduled that evening. Margaret had asked me to organize storage cabinets on the second floor. It was simple work, the kind that kept my hands busy and my mind from drifting toward overdue bills and hospital invoices. I was carrying a stack of neatly folded blankets when I noticed a door at the end of a hallway standing slightly open. That alone was unusual. Every room in Blackwood Manor seemed permanently closed unless someone had a reason to enter. Curious, I stepped closer. Sunlight spilled through the narrow opening, illuminating tiny particles of dust floating in the air. I pushed the door gently and froze. The room looked untouched by time. A cream-colored armchair sat beside a window overlooking the gardens. Fresh books remained arranged on a side table. A piano stood near the far wall. Everything was spotless, yet strangely personal, as if someone had stepped out for lunch and never returned. Then my eyes landed on the photographs. Dozens of them, framed on shelves, displayed on tables, hanging on the walls. Every picture featured the same woman. She had warm brown hair, bright eyes, and a smile that seemed capable of lighting entire rooms. In one photograph, she stood beside Ethan beneath a summer sky. In another, they were laughing on a sailboat. In every image, he looked different. Younger, lighter, alive. My chest tightened. I suddenly understood why the room felt sacred. This had belonged to someone he loved. I should have left immediately. Instead, I found myself staring at a framed picture sitting on the piano. The woman was kneeling beside the fountain in the garden, carefully planting white roses. She looked so happy that I could almost hear her laughter through the photograph. Her name was Claire. The voice behind me nearly made me drop the blankets. I turned and found Ethan standing in the doorway. His expression revealed nothing. Not anger, not surprise, nothing at all. Heat rushed to my face. "I am sorry," I said quickly. The door was open. "I was not trying to invade your privacy." For a long moment, he simply looked at me. Then his gaze shifted toward the photograph in my hands. "Most people avoid this room." His voice was calm, but there was exhaustion beneath it. "Most people are afraid of you," I answered before I could stop myself. The silence that followed felt endless. I immediately regretted speaking. Yet to my surprise, the corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. More like someone remembering how one worked. "And you are not?" he asked. I glanced around the room once more. At the photographs. At the piano. At the roses visible through the window. Then I looked back at him. "No," I said honestly. "I think you are lonely." The words escaped before caution could catch them. Ethan stared at me. The air between us seemed to stop moving. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, the walls he carried around himself appeared to crack. Only for a second. Only enough to reveal a glimpse of the man hidden behind them. Then he looked away toward the window and quietly said something that stayed with me long after I left the room. Lonely is a small word for some kinds of loss. After that conversation, something changed inside the mansion. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to make me notice. Ethan still spent most of his time working. He still disappeared into his office before sunrise and often returned long after dinner. But now, whenever our paths crossed, he no longer looked through me as if I were part of the furniture. He actually looked at me. The difference was small, yet somehow it felt enormous. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call that nearly stopped my heart. I was folding towels in the laundry room when my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. The moment I saw Noah's name on the screen, anxiety rushed through me. My younger brother rarely called during treatment hours. I answered immediately. His voice sounded cheerful, but I knew him too well. Beneath every forced laugh was exhaustion. Beneath every joke was fear. The latest treatment plan was working, but the costs were growing faster than either of us expected. Insurance covered part of it. The rest felt impossible. By the time the call ended, I sat alone on a wooden stool staring at the floor. Numbers swirled through my mind. Medical bills, medication costs, specialist appointments, transportation. Every month felt like trying to hold back the ocean with my bare hands. I blinked quickly and stood before emotion could catch up with me. There was work to do. There was always work to do. That evening, rain tapped softly against the mansion windows while I finished organizing inventory reports in a small office near the kitchen. Everyone else had already left. The clock on the wall read nearly 8:30. My stomach growled. I realized I had skipped dinner without noticing. Again, I gathered my papers and stepped into the hallway. A light still glowed beneath the door of Ethan's office. The entire house seemed asleep except for that single room. As I passed, I heard a quiet voice. "Grace." I froze. Slowly, I turned. Ethan stood in the doorway. His tie was gone. The top button of his dress shirt was undone. He looked tired. Not billionaire tired. Human tired. Yes, I asked. His eyes settled briefly on the folder clutched against my chest. You are still working. I almost laughed. So are you. For a second, silence hung between us. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan actually smiled. Small. Brief. Real. Fair point, he admitted. I had never seen him smile before. It changed his entire face. Made him look years younger. Less like a monument. More like a man. His gaze lingered on me a moment longer. Have you eaten dinner? The question caught me off guard. Not yet. He nodded toward the kitchen. Neither have I. I waited for him to say something else. He did not. He simply stood there. Awkwardly. Almost uncertain. Then I realized what was happening. The loneliest man in Connecticut was trying to ask someone to join him for a meal. And for the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, I saw something beyond the grief. I saw hope trying very carefully to find its way back. The kitchen felt different that night. Smaller somehow. Quieter. The storm outside pressed softly against the windows while warm light spilled across polished countertops and empty chairs. I stood awkwardly beside the dining table wondering whether I should leave and pretend the conversation had never happened. Ethan solved the problem by pulling out a chair and sitting down first. Please, he said. Stay. So I did. Dinner was simple. Soup, fresh bread, and grilled chicken prepared earlier by the kitchen staff. Nothing about it resembled the extravagant meals people probably imagined billionaires ate every night. For several minutes we ate in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Careful silence. The kind shared by two people standing on opposite sides of a bridge neither knows how to cross. Finally, Ethan set down his fork. Margaret says you call your brother every day. The question caught me by surprise. Almost every day. His eyes lifted toward mine. You are close. I nodded. He is the only family I have left. Ethan absorbed that quietly. Outside, rain tapped gently against the glass. What does he do? He asked. I smiled despite myself. Mostly he argues with doctors and refuses to follow instructions. A faint laugh escaped him. The sound was brief, but genuine. That sounds familiar. For a moment I forgot who he was. Forgot the mansion. Forgot the billions. We were simply two tired people sharing a late dinner. Then his expression shifted. Not darker. Sadder. His gaze drifted toward the window overlooking the gardens. Claire used to sit right there. He pointed to the empty chair beside him. The room seemed to still around us. I waited. Ethan rarely volunteered anything personal. She hated eating alone, he continued. She believed meals were meant to be shared. Even breakfast. His voice softened as though speaking to someone no longer in the room. I used to skip meals because of work. She would follow me around carrying coffee and reminding me that businesses survive without their owners for 30 minutes. I smiled. Sounds like good advice. It was. The answer came immediately. No hesitation. No doubt. His eyes remained fixed on the rain beyond the window. I just stopped listening after she was gone. Something tightened in my chest. Not pity. Understanding. Grief leaves empty spaces behind. Some people fill them with noise. Others build entire lives around them. Ethan had built a kingdom around his. The silence stretched between us once more. Then he surprised me again. What keeps you going? He asked quietly. When things become difficult. I looked down at my hands. Thought about Noah. About hospital waiting rooms and unpaid bills and endless uncertainty. Hope, I said. Some days it is strong. Some days it is barely there. But I hold on to it anyway. Ethan studied me for a long moment. His expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly, as if committing the answer to memory. When dinner ended, we stood at the same time. I expected him to return to his office. Instead, he walked with me toward the hallway. Before turning away, he stopped. Thank you for staying, he said. For simple words. Yet something about them lingered with me long after I returned to my room. Because for the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, I realized Ethan was not only beginning to trust me. He was beginning to remember how to let someone into his life. Winter arrived quietly. One cold morning, I opened the curtains in the east wing and discovered the first snowfall of the season covering the grounds in white. The gardens looked transformed. The fountain stood frozen beneath a layer of ice, and the rose bushes rested beneath blankets of snow. For a few moments, the entire estate seemed softer, less haunted, less heavy. I found Ethan standing by the library window later that afternoon. He held a coffee mug in one hand and stared outside with the same distant expression I had come to recognize. "The roses will be back in spring," I said as I dusted a nearby bookshelf. He glanced toward the garden. "Claire used to say that." The comment surprised both of us. I could tell from the brief shift in his expression. Months earlier, he would never have volunteered a memory so easily. Now her name appeared naturally in conversation. Not because the pain had disappeared, because he was finally allowing himself to carry it instead of hiding from it. "She sounds wise," I said. A small smile touched his lips. She usually was. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of us acknowledged. Morning coffee appeared waiting for him before sunrise. Sometimes a note accompanied it with a terrible joke stolen from Noah. To my surprise, Ethan occasionally responded. His handwriting was neat and precise. His sense of humor was absolutely terrible. The first time I laughed at one of his notes, Margaret looked so shocked she nearly dropped a tray. Even the staff began noticing changes. Ethan ate dinner more often. He spent less time locked inside his office. Once, he even attended a holiday charity event without trying to leave after 10 minutes. The mansion felt different too. Warmer. As if someone had opened windows that had been sealed shut for years. Then came Christmas Eve. Most of the staff had gone home to their families. Snow drifted outside, while soft music played somewhere in the house. I had just finished a video call with Noah when I wandered into the main living room. The enormous tree near the fireplace glowed with white lights. Wrapped gifts sat beneath the branches. For a moment, I simply stood there admiring it. "You should open yours." Ethan's voice came from behind me. I turned and found him standing near the doorway holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. The sight alone nearly made me laugh. Billionaires probably were not supposed to look that normal. "You bought me a gift?" I asked. "You bought me one first," he replied. Fair enough. Earlier that week, I had given him a framed photograph of the garden in spring. Nothing expensive, just a reminder that beautiful things return after difficult seasons. He handed me a small box. Inside was a silver bookmark engraved with a simple sentence. "Keep turning the page." I stared at the words for several seconds. My throat tightened unexpectedly. It was not the gift itself. It was the thought behind it. The understanding. When I looked up, Ethan was watching me carefully. "Do you like it?" he asked. I smiled. "I love it." Something changed in his eyes then. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just a quiet realization neither of us seemed ready to name. Outside, snow continued falling across the gardens. Inside, for the first time in a very long time, neither of us felt quite so alone. Spring arrived faster than I expected. The snow disappeared. The gardens awakened. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, and the first rosebuds appeared along the paths Claire had once loved. From the outside, everything seemed to be getting better. That was the strange thing about difficult seasons. Sometimes they begin when life looks beautiful. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. I was trimming flowers near the fountain when my cell phone vibrated. The moment I saw the hospital number, a familiar knot formed in my stomach. By the time the call ended, I could barely feel my hands. Noah's condition had changed. The treatment that had been helping was no longer enough. His specialist wanted to move forward with a new procedure. The chances were good. The cost was devastating. I sat alone on a stone bench for nearly an hour staring at the fountain while numbers repeated inside my head. Savings, loans, bills, dead ends. No matter how many ways I calculated it, the answer remained the same. I did not have enough. That evening, Ethan found me in the library. Normally, I greeted him with a smile. Normally, I asked about his day or handed him one of the terrible jokes Noah liked to send. This time, I could not manage either. "Something is wrong," he said immediately. It was not a question. I forced a smile. "Just tired." His eyes narrowed slightly. Months ago, he might have accepted the lie. Not anymore. Grace. The way he said my name nearly broke me. For one dangerous second, I wanted to tell him everything. The hospital, the fear, the impossible choice waiting ahead. Instead, I looked away. "I am fine." The words sounded hollow even to me. Ethan studied me for a long moment before nodding. He did not believe me. I could tell. Yet he respected whatever boundary I was trying to maintain. After that night, I started changing in small ways. I answered messages more slowly. I spent more time alone. Some evenings I drove into town and returned long after sunset. Each trip brought another meeting, another application, Another attempt to secure funding for Noah's treatment. Nothing worked. The pressure grew heavier every day. Ethan noticed everything. He always had. One afternoon, I caught him watching me through the dining room window while I spoke on the phone. Concern lingered in his expression long after I ended the call. Another evening, he asked whether Noah was doing well. I lied again. The guilt stayed with me for hours. Then came the letter from the hospital. Final approval. Final deadline. Final amount due. I sat alone in my room reading it 3 times before setting it down. My hands shook. The decision arrived with terrifying clarity. There was one remaining option. One sacrifice large enough to change everything. As the sun disappeared beyond the gardens, I opened my laptop and began searching for a way to leave Blackwood Manor. Every keystroke felt like a betrayal, because somewhere along the way, this place had become home. And Ethan Blackwood had become far more important to me than I ever intended. The following week felt like living with a secret stitched into my skin. Every smile required effort. Every conversation demanded caution. I had made my decision, but that did not make it hurt any less. The small house my parents left behind sat 3 hours away in a quiet Pennsylvania town. It was not worth much by billionaire standards. To me, it was everything. Every birthday, every Christmas morning, every memory of a family that no longer existed except in photographs and old voicemail recordings I could never bring myself to delete. Selling it would cover most of Noah's treatment costs. Not all, but enough to give him a chance. So I signed the paperwork. I met with agents. I answered emails late into the night. And I told no one, especially not Ethan. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. One afternoon, he invited me to walk through the gardens with him. The roses were blooming now, filling the air with a soft fragrance Claire would have loved. We moved slowly along the stone path, while sunlight filtered through the trees overhead. Months ago, the silence between us would have felt awkward. Now it felt comfortable, familiar, dangerous. You have been somewhere else lately, Ethan said quietly. My heart stumbled. What do you mean? He stopped beside the fountain and looked at me. You are here, but you are not really here. The accuracy of the observation almost broke me. I forced a smile. Maybe I am just tired. He studied me with those calm gray eyes that seemed to notice everything. Grace. The single word carried 1,000 unspoken questions. I looked away first. That evening I sat alone in my room staring at the final sales agreement. The closing date was only days away. Once it happened, there would be no turning back. My phone buzzed. A message from Noah appeared on the screen. You do not have to save everyone, Grace. For a long moment, I simply stared at the words. Then I laughed through tears. My little brother somehow always knew when I was struggling. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Margaret found me sorting invoices in the office and handed me a sealed envelope. Mr. Blackwood asked me to give you this. Confused, I opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. The handwriting was unmistakably Ethan's. Dinner tonight. No excuses. There was no signature. There did not need to be. Despite everything weighing on me, I smiled. That evening we sat together on the terrace watching the sunset paint the gardens gold. For a while neither of us spoke. Then Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photograph. It was the picture I had given him months earlier. The garden in spring. Do you know why I keep this with me? He asked. I shook my head. His gaze lingered on the image before lifting to mine. Because it reminded me that life continues. The words settled heavily in my chest. Because at that exact moment, hidden inside my bag, was a completed contract proving I was preparing to leave the life we had built together. And for the first time since making that decision, I wondered whether saving one person might end up breaking 2 hearts instead of one. The morning I left began with birdsong and sunlight. The kind of beautiful morning that feels almost cruel when your heart is breaking. I stood in my room surrounded by cardboard boxes and half-packed bags, staring at a life that no longer fit inside 4 walls. The sale of my childhood home had gone through. The funds would reach the hospital within days. Noah would get the treatment he needed. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt hollow. Downstairs, Blackwood Manor was beginning to wake. Staff members moved through hallways carrying coffee and schedules. Somewhere in the distance, a vacuum hummed. Everything seemed normal. That was the hardest part. The world kept moving as if nothing important was happening. I had written the letter 3 times before settling on the final version. Every earlier draft contained too much truth, too much emotion, too much of Ethan. The version resting on my desk now was painfully simple. Thank you for everything. Please do not look for me. I folded it carefully and slipped it into an envelope. My hands trembled the entire time. Around noon, I loaded the last of my belongings into my aging sedan parked near the service entrance. The trunk barely closed. My future looked exactly the same way. Overfilled, fragile, held together by hope and determination. I told Margaret first. She hugged me so tightly I nearly cried. Are you sure? She asked softly. I nodded because speaking felt impossible. Her eyes glistened. He will not take this well. Neither would I. That evening, Ethan was scheduled to attend a corporate event in New York City. It was the opportunity one had been waiting for. The safest way to leave. No difficult conversation. No final goodbye. No chance I would lose the courage to walk away. At 6:30, I watched his car disappear down the long driveway. The moment the taillights vanished beyond the gates, the reality of my decision became unavoidable. This was it. I walked through the mansion one last time. The library, the kitchen, the terrace where we had shared sunsets, the gardens blooming beneath the warm spring sky. Every corner carried a memory. Every room held a piece of someone I had become. When I finally reached the front door, I stopped. The fountain sparkled in the fading light. Roses swayed gently in the evening breeze. Claire's roses. Ethan's second chance. My chest tightened so sharply I had to close my eyes. Be happy, I whispered to no one. Or maybe to both of us. Then I left. 3 hours later, Ethan returned home. I would not learn what happened until much later. How he walked into the library expecting to find me organizing books. How he checked the terrace, the kitchen, the gardens. How confusion slowly became concern. Then panic. Eventually, he found the envelope resting on his desk. Margaret later told me he stood perfectly still for nearly 5 minutes after reading it. No anger. No shouting. No questions. Just silence. The kind of silence that follows loss. And somewhere on a dark highway leading toward Pennsylvania, I drove through the night with tears blurring the road ahead, unaware that Ethan Blackwood had already made a decision of his own. He was not going to let me disappear without finding out why. The first message arrived the next morning. Grace, where are you? It appeared on my phone while I sat beside Noah's hospital bed watching sunlight creep across the floor. I stared at the screen until it went dark. Then I placed the phone face down and pretended my heart was not breaking. The second message came 3 hours later. Are you safe? The third arrived just before midnight. Please answer. I never replied. Not because I wanted to hurt him. Because I knew myself too well. One conversation would be enough. One familiar voice. One moment of weakness. Then everything I had sacrificed would fall apart. Days passed. Noah's procedure was scheduled. Hospital forms replaced moving boxes. Long hallways replaced the gardens. My world shrank to waiting rooms, doctors, and quiet prayers whispered into sleepless nights. Yet Ethan remained everywhere. In every memory. Every habit. Every moment of silence. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Ethan was doing something nobody expected. He stopped pretending everything was fine. Margaret later told me he barely slept. Business meetings were postponed. Interviews canceled. Entire schedules rearranged. The man who had spent years hiding from grief was suddenly chasing it across state lines. He called former employers, contacted property agents, reached out to hospitals, not to invade my privacy, to understand why I had disappeared without warning. Then, one rainy afternoon, he found the answer. The sale records of my childhood home. The amount transferred. The timing. The destination. Suddenly the pieces fit together. Noah's treatments. The worry he had noticed. The exhaustion. The secret phone calls. The forced smiles. Everything. Margaret told me he sat alone in his office for hours after learning the truth. Nobody disturbed him. Nobody dared. Later that evening, he walked into Claire's room for the first time in months. He remained there until after midnight, looking at photographs, reading old letters, remembering, because he finally understood something Claire had always tried to teach him. Love was never measured by what people kept. It was measured by what they were willing to give away. 3 days later, Noah's procedure began. The waiting room felt impossibly cold. I sat alone gripping a paper cup of coffee I could not drink. Minutes stretched into hours. Every time a door opened, my heart jumped. Every time footsteps approached, hope rose and fell again. Then I heard a familiar voice. Grace. For a moment, I thought exhaustion had finally caught up with me. Slowly, I looked up. Ethan stood at the far end of the waiting room. Rain clung to his coat. His hair was damp from the storm outside. He looked tired, determined, real. My breath caught. Neither of us moved. The world seemed to narrow until only the two of us remained. Then Ethan crossed the room and sat beside me, not asking permission, not offering explanations, simply sitting there, present, steady, the way I had once sat beside him during his darkest days. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me with eyes filled not with anger, but understanding. "You should have told me," he said quietly. And for the first time since leaving Blackwood Manor, I allowed myself to cry. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The waiting room hummed softly with distant conversations and the occasional sound of rolling carts in the hallway. Yet all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Ethan handed me a clean handkerchief from his pocket and waited while I wiped away tears I had spent weeks trying to hide. "I did not want you to fix this," I finally whispered. "You have already done more than enough for me." Ethan looked down at his hands for a moment before answering. "That is the problem, Grace." His voice was quiet. "You still think this is about money?" I stared at him. He shook his head slowly. "It stopped being about money a long time ago." The words settled heavily between us. Before I could respond, a doctor entered the waiting room carrying a chart. My entire body tensed. The doctor smiled. "The procedure went well." Relief hit me so suddenly I almost lost my balance. I covered my mouth as tears returned. This time they were different. Lighter. Brighter. Beside me, Ethan released a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. Later that afternoon, we were allowed to see Noah. He looked exhausted but stable, pale but smiling. The moment he noticed Ethan standing beside my bed, a knowing grin appeared on his face. "So this is the mysterious billionaire," he said weakly. I immediately groaned. "Noah." Ethan surprised me by laughing. "I was beginning to think she never mentioned me." "She mentions you all the time," Noah replied. My face burned. Ethan glanced toward me with an expression I could not quite read. Warm, hopeful, dangerous. The next few days passed in a blur of recovery rooms and medical updates. Through all of it, Ethan stayed. Not because he needed to, because he wanted to. He attended meetings remotely, took calls from hospital cafeterias, answered emails from waiting rooms. Every morning he arrived carrying coffee for me and a terrible joke for Noah. Every evening he stayed until visiting hours ended. One afternoon, while Noah slept, Ethan and I sat together near a large hospital window overlooking the city. Sunlight streamed across the floor. For several minutes, we watched people moving below like tiny pieces of a much larger story. "I found out about the house," he said quietly. I closed my eyes. Of course he had. It was the only option. "No," his answer came immediately. "It was the option you chose because you were willing to sacrifice everything for someone you love." I looked away before he could see emotion gathering in my eyes. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what I realized after you left?" I shook my head. His gaze never left mine. "For years I thought losing Claire was the worst thing that could happen to me." He paused. "Then you disappeared." My breath caught. The city beyond the window blurred. "Grace," he said softly, "you helped me live again when I had forgotten how." For a moment neither of us moved. Neither of us looked away. And sitting there beneath the afternoon sun, I realized the greatest gift Ethan Blackwood had ever given me was not his wealth, his influence, or his support. It was the simple fact that he had chosen to stay when walking away would have been easier. 1 year later, the roses were in full bloom again. Warm summer sunlight stretched across the gardens of Blackwood Manor, painting everything in shades of gold and green. Standing beside the fountain, I watched guests gather beneath white canopies while soft music drifted through the air. Laughter echoed across the lawn. Glasses clinked. Somewhere nearby, Noah was telling one of his terrible jokes to a group of investors who were pretending it was funnier than it actually was. Life had a strange way of surprising people. 12 months earlier, I had sat alone in a hospital waiting room convinced I was losing everything. Now I stood in the same gardens that had once belonged to memories and grief, watching them become something new. Ethan appeared beside me without making a sound. He had always done that. Even now, even after everything. His hand slipped gently into mine. "You are thinking too much again," he said. I laughed softly. "You always say that." "Because it is usually true." The fountain sparkled behind us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the guests enjoying the afternoon. The staff looked happy. Margaret looked emotional. Noah looked healthier than I had seen him in years. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of second chances. Ethan followed my gaze toward the roses. Claire would have loved this. The comment carried no sadness, no hesitation, only gratitude. I squeezed his hand. I think so too. That was another thing that had changed. Claire was no longer a shadow standing between the past and the future. She had become part of the story that brought us here. Part of the reason Ethan learned how to open his heart again. Part of the reason I understood that loving someone did not mean replacing what came before. It meant honoring it while still moving forward. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "What is that?" I asked. "The first note you ever left beside my coffee." I stared at him in disbelief. "You kept that?" "I kept all of them." My eyes widened. "All of them?" He smiled. "Every terrible joke. Every encouragement. Every reminder to eat lunch." I laughed so hard I nearly cried. That was when I realized something important. The greatest transformation had never been the mansion, or the business, or even the life we built together. It was Ethan himself. The man who once hid from the world now walked toward it. The man who once measured success in numbers now measured it in moments. As the sun dipped lower across the gardens, Ethan turned toward me. His gray eyes reflected the evening light. Calm. Certain. Home. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" His smile deepened. "For teaching me that surviving is not the same as living." Emotion caught in my throat. Around us, the roses swayed gently in the breeze. The fountain continued its steady song. Life moved forward exactly as it was meant to. And standing there beside the man who had once believed he had lost everything, I finally understood the truth. Money had built his empire. Love rebuilt his soul. And sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones no amount of wealth can ever buy.